Compugen and the Weizmann Institute of Science. He holds a PhD from the Weizmann Institute also. And last but not least, some of you might recognize him, is Professor Dr. Matt Johnson. He is the Susan Hillward Endowed Professor of Psychedelics at Johns Hopkins, working with psychedelics for 17 years now. He's one of the world's most published psychedelic experts. He publishes psychedelic safety guidelines in 2008, helping to resurrect psychedelic research. He developed the first psychedelic treatment for tobacco addiction, and he has published on psychedelics and safety factors, mystical experiences, personality change, cancer-related distress treatment, and MDD treatment. His 2018 psilocybin reviewed recommended Schedule 4 upon medical approval. Interviewed by Dr. Andrew Cooper in 60 Minutes, New York Times, Washington Post. He's basically everywhere. So, warm welcome to our panel. Yes, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. I think what we'll do today is I'm going to walk through Negev Labs, its inception, its reason for existence, and what we're trying to do in this sector of ours. Is that too loud? Sound okay? All right. Then my colleague will walk through the process in which we develop new ventures in this space and share a couple of examples. So you get an understanding of the kinds of projects that we take on and the kinds of companies we launch. And then Matt is going to speak about the areas of particular interest, exciting sectors within psychedelics. We are here not to seek safe ideas. We're here to find radically good ideas that deserve to be developed. So there was supposed to be an additional panelist with us. Unfortunately, he took ill, he's fine, but he wasn't able to be here with us, and that's Ken Belotsky. He's the he's one of the founding partners of Negev Capital. And it's good to take a moment just to, I'll share with you the essence of what he would have said if he was here. Negev Capital spent the last 3+ years looking at every single company in the psychedelic drug development field. Every one. We've looked at over 180 companies, deep due diligence on 80, invested in over 27. But through that process, we wound up developing a real intelligence, an understanding of where the field is headed. We developed a network, a fantastic network of leading minds in the sector. We were able to bring on board expertise that's complementary to all the what was nascent projects. Happily, many of them are in clinical study at this point. And that's really where Negev Labs emerged. We realized we have drug development expertise in-house. We have this constellation of some of the brightest minds in the field. We have this intelligence that was a byproduct of all the effort that Negev Capital did to support the best. Hello, it's back on. To support the best drug development that was taking place, one natural byproduct of that was a hell of an education. And we have, not least because of a basis we have in Israel, we have the ability to do high quality, efficient, and pretty fast preclinical and clinical R&D. So we pulled all that together and said we should incubate, we should develop the best ideas. So we'll start with a fallacy. You have a good molecule, you have a good thought. I need some money, capital, and I'm gonna achieve success, which in this space, I think it's a truism for everybody I've met in this conference. Success is defined as doing good for patients, the do good aspect, as well as the doing well aspect for the stakeholders and the people who enable these drugs to be developed and help people. But this isn't true. A good molecule alone won't bring you the capital because that's not what's required. You're not going to be successful in that way. Think of it more like this. In addition to capital, you need a good indication strategy. What are you doing? What are you aiming at particularly, and that's going to be beneficial to patients. What is a clinical unmet need, not just today, but what are future unmet needs that your drug is targeting? Intellectual property, which is also speaks to wastage. Is somebody else on the other side of the planet already working on what you're working on, and maybe it's superior, maybe it's not? Will it have value? Pharma R&D strategy. At the end of the day, you need to go from a molecule or a concept to something that can be developed through a pharma development process and make it to market. And you need to have the experience and skills on board to do that efficiently. As preclinical gets. This starts day one. This is not something for later. Forgive me if there's any lawyers in the room, but the boring requisite stuff. You need to have the right legal structures and contracts in place to govern all of this. And financing and financial management. All of this costs money. Money needs to be managed properly. And money needs to be raised. And all of this is enabled if you have good mentors and experts in each one of these specific areas to help you along that way. Another way to consider it is we're developing promising ideas in psychedelics, but the way I like to consider it, particularly for the folks in this room, is we're entouraging promising ideas, right? We're seeking the scientists and the creative people and the people who develop concepts that can achieve success, and we're entouraging them with all of the assets that Negev Labs brings to bear. Then we can attract, and we'll fund it, and then we can attract growth capital and actually launch ventures that'll go out and do success as we achieve it. So the team we brought together to do this, Kostya Adamsky, my colleague, is here. He's CEO of Negev Labs. We have one of the leading psychiatrists, and he's also a clinical researcher from Columbia. Myself, I was introduced previously. Dr. Benny Lair from Hadassah. Alan Kozakowski, he's one of the top medicinal chemists on the planet. Ken Belotsky, who is a founder of Negev Capital. Vadim Uzberg, in terms of financing, financial management, structure, he has 20 years of experience. Calix Law is probably the leading law firm, and Graham Pachenik, the leading mind when it comes to intellectual property and psychedelic medicine. And you may have heard of Matt Johnson. He's also with us. Let me hand it over to you, Kostya.
Hey, thank you, Hayim. Oh, it's too loud. Okay. It's okay? Yeah. So I will go through the processes. So one of the first one is doing drug discovery pipeline. So to understand if the idea is worth to continue with it. And it's not only IP, okay, we check the IP, it's new molecule, but it's not enough because we don't look something that is new molecule just to be a new molecule. It should have some potential unmet need. And we have a sophisticated algorithm that can predict the unmet need for the indications in the future. And this is important because the development of the drug takes time. So it's 5-7 years in the best case scenario till we go to the market. And everything can change there. So there are other drugs in the pipeline. What the success of these drugs? So you don't want to compete with something that you're going to lose there. So we check this one. We check the, of course, IP. We do the assessment of the work that should be done to have a proof of concept. And if it works, so we take the project on board. And then is strategy planning and implementation. What we know how to do it is to do it in a cost and time-effective way. So, and I will show in the next slides as an example what we have there. So preclinical proof of concept, investment, because it costs money. We're not afraid to invest in a bold or radical ideas, but we're also not afraid to stop the project if we see it doesn't work. So it will be waste of money, so it's better to go to other projects and fund other projects. If everything works, so again, I believe in 2 years, is extensive pre-IND safety trials, which cost around 1 million or something like that, and a new company launch, and all the process way to success. basically with everything what is about the new company, okay? So I give you 2 examples. Maybe it's good example because one is collaboration with university, with the lab of Professor Benilero. He's a professor in psychiatry. He's running the brain labs. It's National Institute for the Neurological Diseases. And he has brilliant idea, treatment schizophrenia. And just to, doesn't matter, I don't want to go deeply in a project, but what I want to show here is a timeline. So in 9 months, we start from basically from the idea, and we're already in a midway. So half a year from the proof of concept in human clinical trial, which is great achievement. The other project is with Kozakowski, with Alan Kozakowski. So he's has ideas with new molecules inspired from psychedelic drugs that are good for pain, for the chronic pain, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer, for example, yeah, and also mental disease. And again, during 9 months, so I can tell that we synthesized 9 molecules. Out of these 9 molecules, we have 4 molecules that show great results in vitro, and some of them already in vivo. So it's a great achievement, and that shows how we know what to do and how to do in very short time, and small money, I can tell you. Yeah, to get a proof of concept and to achieve what we can achieve. Basically, that's it. And we're interested in new ideas, in psychedelic or psychedelic inspired, and yeah, new molecules. So.
Hey, so I'm Matt, and I guess as an academic, I'd want to start by saying that I've been very cautious in terms of advisory relationships and any sort of formal involvement with the industry that's really grown up in the last several years. When I started in 2004, I never thought we would be here. I mean, it was actually the Insight meeting of, I believe their first meeting back, I think, 5 years ago, something like this, where I talked to someone in the hallway, and they said, "Oh, I'm involved with a psychedelic company and we're starting." Like, what? That's a thing? Like, what? It's hard to imagine how far things have come. But I've been very, very cautious, and I have to say, my relationship with Hayim has preceded the formation of Negev Capital, and reason I'm involved is that I knew him to be a good-hearted person that was in this area from the business side for all the right reasons, really wanted to help patients and do things right. And when he introduced me to this, said, look, it's kindred spirits like us, other folks. And I already knew Graham Prochenik on the IP side, on the legal side, that I already knew was in that category. And everyone else I've met involved is, again, in that kindred spirit category. So just want to emphasize that. And to describe a little more about my role, I won't repeat my, was a reminder. I need to shorten that. I think that was from a few years ago. It's like, God, that's too long. But I've been involved with this research for a long time. Basic studies of several different therapeutic applications with psilocybin. I've seen a lot, been involved with a lot of different study designs, addressing different questions, whether it's therapeutics or understanding how these psychedelics are working, how they're affecting people at the psychological level. And so that kind of sets me up for my role here in terms of really understanding the clinical landscape and, importantly, identifying opportunities, identifying those opportunities in the clinical landscape. And, this is when hopefully, based on the data, MDMA and psilocybin within the next few years are approved for medical use outside of research, I always tell folks, that's just the beginning. Like, it's gonna get interesting. All the best science is yet to be done. And especially with this radically new model of psychiatric medical treatment, and it's not just mental health, there's neurological, et cetera. It's gonna call for creative studies, this very different model of administering this thing, and then you have these lasting effects that change the way your behavior and the way you're interacting in the world in a more persisting fashion. But there's gonna need to be studies that really address things like frequency of use. It's not always one and done. In fact, that's probably not gonna be the norm when treating these disorders. So studies that really get into the type of stuff that makes me excited, but might look boring from the outside, the real parametric studies addressing questions of modularity of dosing and clinician judgment and frequency and number of doses, what, for some disorders, what form of sort of support or therapy might be appropriate. Adjuncts, we're in our infancy on all of this. And those are all going to be really important areas in helping building companies to get to that success. How to address, the treatment of whatever disorder we're talking about. And just, already it's been a great process. And recently on a call, I shared the idea with the team, like, it's funny, we'll be in, Berlin, and it seems like, we've forgotten as a field the primary model that was used extensively in Europe in the older era from the 50s through the early 70s of psychedelic therapy was not the heroic dose, what became known as psychedelic therapy proper, blast someone away with a very high dose, prepared support, more of the kind of one and you're done, but it was called psycholytic therapy was the model here in Europe. And that was using a modest dose, not a microdose, but about 100 mics of LSD if you're familiar. So, nothing to sneeze at, but in conjunction with talk therapy. And there's not a single study that compared the two, heroic dose versus psycholytic, and we've completely forgotten that. That's gonna be important to look at, because my strong inclinations, there's gonna be a number of disorders where that actually is gonna be perhaps a more helpful model, perhaps just as or more helpful than the high dose sessions. So there's that, there's the frequency, the combinations, all that whole clinical landscape, combinations across time, and even, co-administration of, these different medicines. The list goes on and on. Again, the interesting science has only just begun. So I'm excited to serve that role with the team in helping people to develop those ideas and ultimately achieve regulatory approval and get to the point where we're helping patients on a number of different disorders. So that's my story. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayim. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Matt. It's a very beautiful project that you bring with you to Berlin today. It seems to me like exceptional scientists sometimes need guarding rails so that they can actually develop an idea into something that is actually profitable and scale it and bring it to the market. Yeah, and not, at least from where I'm standing, I don't see that scientists in biology, neuroscience, and all of these very specific careers learn a lot about finances and operations and strategy and so on and so on and so on. And having said this, I would like to ask the public who has a good idea that only needs capital today to become successful. Who brought with you a good idea that only needs capital to become successful? Yeah, there is one there.
Oh, what, a microphone, really? Hello? Okay, yeah. I guess something to me that's been an interesting topic, that's a space that I think a few people have kind of touched on, but I haven't really seen anybody delve into is and I get one of your projects seems to be working on is the psychedelics for neuroinflammatory disorders and psychedelics as anti-inflammatories more broadly. We seem to be seeing some early efficacy in the animal models and in vitro models, but a lot would need to be worked out in terms of how often these drugs need to be dosed, what a regimen would look like, whether the psychedelic trip is at all necessary if what you're looking for is a biological rather than a physiological or a psychological response, and what the biomarkers for treating those conditions might be. So that for me is a direction that I think there's a lot of potential for psychedelics, and I haven't seen, there's a few companies at very early stages, but not a lot of things that I see in later stage development like Cybin or Mindset or et cetera.
The question is around, do we have any thoughts on the matter, or have we?
Yeah, I guess how the main rationale good idea is
Two general comments, and then I'll hand it off to smarter minds than mine on the specific applications in anti-inflammatory. First is thanks for making that comment, because we are here to solicit you. We're here to listen to any ideas that are had. Right? Negev Labs is discerning, of course, but it's environments like this, and it's getting the word out like this that I would like to invite anybody to speak with us afterwards. If you're bold enough, grab a microphone and you can raise a discussion now if you wish. So thanks for making that point. Yeah, or talk afterwards. The other point is the inverse of what I said. It's the ideas around developing a novel molecule, or this novel molecule may have broad applications. That requires a hell of a lot more than just the capital. That's the point of Negev Labs' existence. And we found a lot of wastefulness. I mean, if every idea for a novel molecule involved somebody with good or bad intent grabbing a hold of some opportunity and going and setting up a company and marketing and trying to raise capital for it, we think that's wasteful compared to what Negev Labs can do. That we can create an economy of scale. We can apply we can apply some of the brightest minds in the sector to a multiplex of ideas. So there's an economy of scale created there. The scientists can focus on the science. And it also enables us to pivot faster. And we come to no's quickly, which is just as valuable as coming to a yes quickly, all under one roof. I don't know if you have any.
I think it's an incredibly important area. It's just like, as I reminded myself earlier, it's not just psychiatry, it's neurology. And then this, just straight up, internal medicine, and just like, who doesn't know someone who's suffered from the horrific effects of prednisone in treatment of so many disorders? Can't sleep, gain weight, feel like crap, but it's, so, I can only say that's a great, as a psychologist, so, not an inflammation expert, but obviously an area of just incredible potential that needs to be developed with psychedelics that has a huge potential to influence and help a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I can tell that we have several projects in this direction in pipeline in neuroinflammatory, especially neuroinflammatory. And by the way, the neurodegenerative disease are connected to this. So and I'll say that we want to go a little bit out of the psychiatric indications because it's a lot of competition there. So, and the psychedelics inspire new molecules have a huge potential in other fields, not only in psychiatry. So that's exactly what we are looking for.
Thank you.
I guess what makes, after our discussions, what I like to see with companies
there's a question to you. How do you think that your eclectic mix can achieve the balance of diversity and focus when you have people of different backgrounds, especially making key decisions? And secondly, the second question of that is, what do you mean by radical? I'd like to hear about now. Is it, so that's a bit of a loaded question, but when you say radical, I want to know what makes Negev Labs more radical. Thank you.
I'll start with the first, and I'll give you my definition of radical. I really want to hear Kostya's. So first, the eclectic mix is designed, right? Kostya's built companies specifically in drug development. I've been in different sectors of biotech for 25 years. Ken Belotsky is a very accomplished entrepreneur. The eclectic mix is an architected eclectic mix. Like what we know is going to be required to take an idea, develop it, and eventually launch a company for the best ideas. So in terms of bandwidth of that group, we haven't hit it yet. We have 4 projects now. Remember, this company was founded in Q4 of 2022. So we're 9 months plus old. And we already have the 2 projects advanced in the stage they're in. We can't speak about the other 2 at the moment. And we have a pipeline where we want to bring in more. So we're not at capacity yet, but we have every intention of expanding the team under Kostya's leadership, probably towards the end of 2024. And radical, I don't think of radical in a mechanical definition in this space. I think radical is what suffered bullshit stigma. That's what radical is, because Lord knows we have the evidence, right? As long as we hold medicine accountable to being evidence-based, we got the evidence. There's nothing radical about efficacy. It's radical because of this artificial restraint that was placed on this potent class of molecules for 50 years.
Yeah, so I don't have anything to add to radical. Yeah, that's exactly the point. So if everyone says, okay, that's a bullshit idea, maybe it's not. Okay, so we are ready to hear, and we like non-conventional approach. To the first question, I would like to add that it's a good diversity. So all of us been in companies in academia. I work in academia for several years. Run the companies. So investment company, we work there. So we know how feel the researcher or inventor. We know what feel investor, what feel the management of the company. So it's not, we are not distinct from all this field. So it's a great opportunity. We know what's needed from all aspects of the drug development and the company.
Hello. Okay. Hi. One of the biggest problems perceived in our community, I'm a psychiatrist, but I think it's quite common, is the fear that producing medicine with a reduced trip experience or without a trip experience could be somehow not effective as the one with experiences. So are you contemplating the possibility to have such medicine? So far we don't have exact data, as far as I know, around the effectiveness of the experience with trip or without tripping. So that's my question for all of you, if you want.
Maybe I will start and then I give to yeah.
Thank you.
It's $1 billion question, so no one knows if trip is necessary or not. So we believe. That's where we're going. So I strongly believe that it depends from indication. So in the psychiatry, I believe that the trip is necessary and the therapy is necessary. But if we talk about the chronic pain, for example, inflammation, neurodegenerative disease like Parkinson, Alzheimer, probably not. Probably not, but that's where the science should come in, step in, and give the clear answer.
I could, yeah, so I would echo certainly what Kosti was saying about it. It's very possible that this differs by indication. And certainly for the non-mental health disorders, it certainly seems like, hey, if you can do this without the experience, more people will be helped. And I think ultimately we need to remember that. Many of us, have appreciated the experiences that people have on psychedelics, but if it's talking about helping someone with a debilitating disorder, however we can make it work, we want to help the folks. The biggest thing that, even beyond sort of that it may differ by indication, I think this is my kind of where I've come, and I was forced to come here a while ago when all of this, and it's probably true for both the microdosing and potential non-psychedelic analogs of the existing 2A agonist. My take is, we obviously have more data at this point on the heroic dose psychedelic therapy model with the overt psychedelic experience. I've helped produce a lot of the data showing there is a relationship between that subjective, not just even having an experience, but the psychological nature of that experience, the unitive, mystical experience, call it what you will, oceanic boundlessness by other scales, same thing. And long-term, 6 months later, effects. So there's evidence there. More evidence can be brought to bear, but my strong bets are, in that model, the subjective effects are clearly part of the package and necessary. However, we're in our infancy. I'm a big fan of the development of non-psychedelic analogs, exploration of small, what's come to be known as microdosing, which may be viewed from a similar lens. Because if there is a future there, and it all depends on the data, then my prediction is that it would simply be a different treatment model. I would bet there's very little chance, always open to the data, but there's very little chance that you're gonna take a non-psychedelic analog one time, not have any altered experience, and then we're seeing a year later that you're still, you're trying to quit drinking, and you're still sober, trying to quit smoking, you're not smoking, you're substantially less depressed, etc., less anxious, cancer, if you just have major depression. That seems pretty implausible to me, that you would have one of these, non-experiences, and you have one administration and you're seeing effects a year later. Okay? That doesn't mean that it won't work, though. I think, and this is where that complex clinical science comes into play, and we need to be open-minded. My best guess is that if there's a future to these non-psychedelic analogs, that it's going to be a more frequent treatment model. It is going to look more like what we typically think of with psychiatric medications. Yeah, you take this pill every morning, or every night, or who knows, depending on the time course, maybe twice a week, or what have you, but on some sort of frequent chronic basis. Again, open to the data, could be wrong. I'd put some money on that as a bet. So it just depends. And I kind of remind people, if augmenting, without an experience, we've known for, 80 years now, that chronically augmenting extracellular serotonin in one way, shape, or form, where it was the original monoamine and tricyclics, or then the SSRIs in the 80s, and then SNRIs, that chronically manipulating the serotonin system can, for a lot of people, and there can be improvement, but for a lot of people, can have a very real effect in decreasing depressive symptoms. Hopefully you all saw the plenary session, saw some data relevant to that. So it would not be surprising at all if a more frequent treatment model in this different way of interacting with the serotonin system as an agonist at the 2A, a much more specific, which potentially, theoretically, first principles, could have the potential to have less side effects because it's less broad-based throughout the brain. at a number of receptors, but having a more targeted effect at 2A receptors rather than flooding the synapse with as much endogenous serotonin as possible. That's an extremely plausible hypothesis. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that could help with the depression and a number of other disorders. We need the data. So I guess long-winded way to say is like, it's not one or the other. Where we're at now, we have more data on the heroic dose model, but it's not, I encourage people not to be offended. Some people treat it like heresy. You're trying to take the trip out of this. That's the heart of it. I agree. I've produced a lot of the work in the scientific literature to help, cement that in terms of the science. Not that a lot of people needed to know that who have had those experiences, but I'm very open, as I just explained, just as one example, how it would just look different. And I'm all for, another important piece on this is that not everyone is going to want to have a psychedelic experience, and some people aren't going to be medically qualified to have a psychedelic experience. Hopefully we can have some different compounds. Psilocybin does have some cardiac effect, modestly raises blood pressure, but people at the severe end of heart disease we have to exclude them for good reason. Going up a few flights of stairs or shoveling snow can send that person to the emergency room with a cardiac event. So it'd be great if those people who either were frankly frightened or just personality-wise, they hear about these experiences, which can have a dark side, the bad trip, the challenging, and say, I never want to touch that stuff. There's always going to be folks like that, and there's going to be folks that don't medically qualify for a high-dose experience. So I think it's great if these other models, the non-psychedelic analogs, it would look more like, I think, traditional psychiatric medicine, and that's fine. We need better models of all types. We need more tools in the toolbox. So it's not this versus that. It's keeping an open mind and get some data. Any other thoughts?
I agree with you, Matt. I think that it's also, even independently, if you're treating one diagnosis or another, maybe there's a protocol where you use a psychedelic state and then you combine it with these other compounds that don't have a psychedelic inducing experience.
Right. And I've shared this before, and thank you, because that's the other. I always provide a lot of caveats, but this is something I've often brought up in these conversations. Maybe the ideal model is to have for those that qualify, have the heroic dose session, and then maybe we find out, that window of neuroplasticity that we know happens in the animal models, but it's a good bet, probably, but we don't know what's happening in the human therapeutics. Maybe that window ends up, we find, making this up, on average lasts 1 week. Well, maybe we can administer some of these non-psychedelic analogs and extend that window for a month and keep you in cognitive behavioral therapy, and then substantially increase the number of people who are successfully treated.
Hi there. Yeah, Anna Schlag, Drug Science. I just wanted to go back to your call for potential funding needs as well as the call for more data. What do you think in terms of real-world evidence collection? We have opportunities at the moment, whether it's anything that happens in various US states, Canada as well. I know Therapeutic, for example, are collecting their data. Australia offers another case in point, Jamaica, retreat centers globally. And especially in terms of looking at the long-term outcomes. There are a lot of patients who have patients or people who go to these centers and really systematically and longitudinally, developing ways of analyzing this data. And I'm just looking kind of back in terms of the things that happened with medical cannabis in the US. There wasn't a systematic analysis. Health Canada did it slightly better, I suppose, but it's really a shame to lose this opportunity not to analyze the data that we already have and that seems to be developing globally as well. So what about investing in that as well? That would be kind of my question.
Actually, the value of real-world data, personally, I place a great deal of stock in it, right? Because we're talking about novel molecules, for Negev Labs perspective, novel molecules that are derived from extant molecules with sometimes millennia of historical usage. So anecdotal usage I also, on a personal note, I worked in another life before I came into the psychedelic space. I worked in infectious disease diagnostics, big data, and I spent a lot of time in Africa. Think about something like ibogaine and the different alkaloids in it. It's actually related to one of our Negev Labs projects. The indigenous uses for which there's nothing but it's almost a derisive term, anecdotal evidence. But one anecdote's an anecdote. 1,000 anecdotes becomes data. So I think there's a great deal of merit in aggregating and normalizing, and there's entire companies and fields attempting to normalize disparate data into some cohesive block of data that you can analyze. If that helps point in a direction on indication or a direction in novel molecule development, like one of our projects in ibogaine, great, all for it.
Absolutely, because even in the, whatever several hundreds of patients that I've worked with or, or discussed in these clinical trials, there are off-target effects all over. I think it's almost become a joke with our line of smoking cessation research with psilocybin that even though I kind of warned them, I do warn them, folks pretty routinely come back at one of the follow-ups 6 months later or after their experience and say, Matt, this is about way more than quitting smoking. And I mean, it can transform people, as I'm sure many of you know. It doesn't always, of course, there's variability, but people, I mean, the list of things like where folks, they're in it for, cancer anxiety, and from the trivial to like someone spontaneously just stops a lifelong nail biting habit. Sleep, that comes up. Like they've never, they didn't come in for insomnia, but there's like, this is the first time I've really slept well in decades. And I don't have to take something, prescription over the counter to try to help me sleep. It goes on. Something that doesn't get talked about a lot, I've had a number of particularly older folks say this has dramatically improved their sex life with their partner of 40 years. I've had a number of women in their 70s tell me this, that like this really can affect people in a broad number of ways. So I just think some of this, like some of these are just a few examples of, and gosh, probably the big one I got to mention is trauma. Like, I just came here to quit smoking. It's like, and we warn people, of course, you have something from 30 years ago that you never processed, do not be surprised. Boom. And the way, at least with the heroic dose model, is no, you're not controlling this. You may or may not even think about smoking during the experience, but you deal with what comes up. We're there to support you, and trauma comes up. So anyway, those are examples of these off-target effects. To sound really nerdy and to sounds kind of dismissive, but now I've got a good inclination about some of these things, and like you don't have not all of these off-target things are an issue for everyone in this study, and so you don't have the statistical power to do anything with that other than share them as anecdotes like I just did with you. Multiply that by 800,000 people have gotten this medication across these number of, now we're analyzing the data, and it's like, wow, the number of people that have mentioned that this has helped their sleep, the number of people that mentioned that it's improved their sex life, the number of people that, et cetera. So I absolutely believe that's going to be, even compared to other areas of medicine, it's important generally, but I would say particularly important. This has such a general mechanism, at least the psychedelic, the experience-driven, all of the relevant hypotheses are about this general mechanisms: behavioral, neuroplasticity, openness, mental flexibility, applicable to, you go down the list of mental health disorders. Not saying it's been shown to work for everything, but decent hypothesis that it can be brought to bear on so much because of the very general, not surface level receptor mediating this disorder or that disorder, but these very general mechanisms across the CNS and across human psychology. So given that, that's why I say this area is particularly ripe for those off-target effects, and that the big data, phase 4, et cetera, however, we do it, big data is going to be really important for identifying those, and I bet there's going to be a bunch.
Yeah, I just want to add, emphasize there is a huge gap between in translational medicine between the animals model and human. And we don't know anything about how psychedelics work. So we just discussed earlier today that there's a huge potential that psychedelics would be slip out of the development, if not the early use of psychedelics. Because if you use the animal models for depression, for example, it doesn't work there. So you put SSRI, it works. You put psilocybin, it doesn't work. But we know that psilocybin works perfectly in human. So that's kind of things that, whereas this anecdotal data is more important than anything else.
Is it okay? One more? Yeah. Okay, so you were talking about these off-target effects. We were talking about whether it's possible to have the effect, the healing effect without the trip. It's probably somewhere in long, like far away in into the future. But what do you think about being able at some point to shape the content of the psychedelic trip? Because this is something that it's right now we are relying on the inner healer. There is a lot of lore also surrounding. If you take truffles, it's going to put you into trauma area. If you take mushrooms, it's going to do something else. But we don't know that. So I was wondering, can you comment on the horizon for that?
Okay, that's a beautiful example of this type of, I think, the radical thinking and this horizon that's going to get so complex with so many important questions we can explore empirically. Absolutely. So, who hasn't heard of set and setting? The idea that these drug effects can be radically affected by context. I published a paper in my lab a couple of years ago. Justin Strickland was the first author, doing something that sounds pretty trivial of manipulating the playlist. And actually it was a part of tacked onto the psilocybin smoking cessation, tobacco smoking cessation study. So you either get the playlist, which is mainly classical, which a lot of the research uses, and Brahms, and et cetera, versus an alternative playlist. And we use kind of some drone sounds and things like this. We found a little bit of a trend for this, like the wacky new thing, to not statistically significant, small sample, but the trend was to be higher, more well-liked by people and to be associated with greater success. And more people chose it. They actually got exposed to the one, then the other, randomized order in the first 2 sessions, and the third, they got a choice. So we had a lot of data to bear. Small sample again. The reason I bring it up is because I scoured the literature because I don't want to make a false statement. Despite that we all know the importance of set and setting, that was the first study in psychedelic science, older era, going back to 50s, new era, that has ever experimentally randomized a set and setting variable. So, and that's a small, just different genre of music. What about music versus none? What about, outdoor? What about the outdoor clinic versus like a hospital room? What about, all of this, I think is, just to be clear, about shaping the nature of the subjective experience. And that's before we get into, okay, to add into that VR, add into that specific preparations that you do, specific intentions that are set. None of this is fully explored at all. So absolutely, I could imagine, and then just, gosh, like wildly different ideas, like TMS, using magnets to affect brain function. Maybe 20 years from now, it's like, no, you get in there, you wear your little baseball hat that hopefully by that point you can wear that has the TMS that's affecting brain function that way, and it's helping you direct that psychedelic experience after you take the psychedelic. And maybe that's a way to, guide the experience more in one direction or another that would be therapeutically helpful. So I think that's, there's going to be a lot of work, and I think that's extremely possible.
Do you think you can modulate the dimension the psychedelic experience comes from the molecular design of?
So in broad strokes, we already know the answer to that is yes. In other words, if we go compare the classic psychedelics, which are by and large very similar subjectively, except if it's rapid onset DMT, et cetera. It's a little different. That's more about the onset of action. But ayahuasca slowly coming on DMT is very similar to psilocybin. But comparing the classic psychedelics as a group to MDMA, clearly there's a difference. Clearly changing the mind. And MDMA is very close to mescaline, a prototype classic psychedelic to both of the phenethylamine analog class. So that's a great example. On both the positive side, both can be extremely positive, but what we call the full mystical unitive experience is less likely with MDMA, more likely with the classic psychedelics like mescaline. But at least certain types of what we call the bad trip, challenging experience, like reality itself is unzipping and existential terror because I don't even know what a human is anymore. One way, far less likely to happen with MDMA. The bad trip on MDMA is more of a really sitting with your despair, just as one example, like emotional despair as you're kind of much more emotionally open with yourself. So it's just not that it can be, sometimes it's extremely difficult when MAPS treats people with trauma, for example, but it's of a different nature. So we already know this to be true. So absolutely, I think many of these new compounds are going to be, and if you go, I mean, gosh, look at Reed Shulgin's P-Cal and T-Cal, all kinds of anecdotes, but I think there's something there even amongst the classic psychedelics. Oh yeah, this one has a little smoother come on, this one is a little more, this one has more body load, this one has, is even more, all of these examples. So I think, there's a huge potential. There's every reason to think there's going to be, and MDA, not MDMA, but MDA has often been described as kind of a bridge between MDMA, the entactogen, and the classic psychedelic. So that's another thing. We kind of already know there's some data consistent with that.
Next to that question, so that would mean that thinking in that direction, certain conditions would react better to a certain type of psychedelic experience. Would you say this or this condition should go in the mystical experience or the more? What would you say about it?
So we really just need more data. I can easily imagine both. There is something I call sort of the generalized psychedelic mechanism hypothesis where, and I actually have some data I'm working on publishing right now based on survey where people intentionally took a psychedelic in the wild, so to speak, not in a clinical study, but for treating depression, anxiety, or PTSD, with either MDMA or any number of the other, the classic psychedelics. And so far, the data is almost suggesting you could do like, the old game ad libs, give me an adverb, give me a noun, give me a blah, and you come up with this like absurd like sentence, where it could be any combination, like MDMA for depression. Well, hold on, I thought MDMA was the one for PTSD, like it's psilocybin for depression. Well, not a clinical trial, but these evidence in terms of reported success rates in these thousands of people, MDMA for depression, similar success rates as psilocybin for depression, or psilocybin for PTSD. So there's that, but I would also want more data, but it may be, for example, that MDMA is ideal because of the lack of the potential face-melting bad trip. That maybe that really is ideal for people with extreme PTSD, or maybe looking to the underground world. Something's often been reported, going back to Leo Zeff and others. Hey, you start with MDMA. Then depending on their, response, a few weeks later, then we decide either maybe we'll stick at MDMA or maybe it's time to move up to the full classic psychedelic. So yeah, it could really could be both, potential for both.
We need more radical ideas being developed.
Yes.
Ask one question. So what about the potential of psychedelics at the two ends of the spectrum, the cradle and the grave? So what about psychedelics in palliative care? And what about psychedelics in juveniles and children who have actually more serotonin receptors present? So there is serotonin involved in many neurodevelopmental disorders, But are we at that stage when we can give psychedelics to children?
Is that a me question? Jump in anytime. I'm not trying to avoid drugs for kids. It's like sensitive topic. Take it.
What mechanisms? I mean, the question comes from autism spectrum disorders where
Yeah.
serotonin can help.
So this is where I think we need to have radical thinking, always being ethical and cautious. But a lot of people are surprised to hear that at the FDA, the United States Medicine Approval Agency, highly incentivizes and even really wants and kind of forces you to go down that path. MDMA or MAPS already has plans to do, like they want you to say, if you have this great treatment that ends up being approved for PTSD, great. You know, PTSD is also a problem in adolescence. So, and I forget the particular age ranges, but they say, well, now we want research from 16 to 18-year-olds. Because those people commit suicide who have PTSD in that range and have other severe consequences. After we know it's approved, we know a lot about safety, and we cautiously then move to that category. Then that looks positive. Then you move to the, again, don't quote me on the numbers, but something like the 13 to 16-year-old range. And and so I'm really glad and MAPS has plans already in place for that. And I think it would be unethical not to do that, explore that cautiously. It really would, because there's a lot of suffering. There's a lot of suffering in young people with depression. And obviously it may be a different treatment model, and you have even higher standards for that caution going into that. But it's really important. I mean, right. For those that may have not heard it online, Hayim was saying that goes back to the talk about doses, like the psycholytic experience. So maybe it's a lower dose that's more appropriate for a younger, right? A non-tripping.
And theoretically may work even better in children because the plasticity of the brain is still ongoing there. So it's much easier to do the plasticity and changes that are necessary in the young people than in adults. So if it works in adults, definitely. And if they, I think it's already approved for the autism in a young children. There is a company that is doing with the psilocybin, but I don't remember if they approved the phase 2. But yeah, they're open for this. FDA is open and everyone. So at the moment it's safe. Definitely, it depends from the indication. But PTSD, autism.
And even moving outside of mental health, I happen to think of it because my wife is a neuroscientist who studies in rats as models, but has also collaborated with clinicians at the NICU at her university, models of, for example, hypoxia ischemia, that kids who, when they're born or just before they're born or during childbirth, are cut off from oxygen. And, how do you help, prevent death and or lifelong debilitation? And there's a lot that science has already figured out. It's not a crazy idea that you want to inject some radical neuroplasticity into perhaps a child. Like there's some, I guess, a different type of birth trauma than we normally might think about in psychedelic medicine, but actually, trauma like, oxygen deprivation, during birth. Maybe a nice dose of DMT or another compound would, again, very cautious. You start with animal models there clearly, but again, radical thinking. Like it would be unethical to not do everything we can to not help women and their children who have these traumatic events during childbirth.
Hi, so what I experience in my practice is that pharmacological interventions, especially in depression, are often based on trial and error. So they try different medications and they have to move on to different ones because we have responders and non-responders and sometimes don't know what works best for whom. So I was just wondering, as a future perspective, if we could establish biomarkers or other morphological characteristics of the brain to classify what psychedelic would work best on what patients, so they wouldn't have to go through trying out different agents or being maybe sad that one didn't work and wouldn't go for others. So I was just wondering if that would be a nice prerequisite to have before starting with therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. The biomarkers are sort of the holy grail in medicine, as you know. And, you know, so far there's a lot of disappointment, you know, in medicine in terms of achieving that vision. But, you know, I mean, as technology in terms of everything, the phone in your pocket and everything is like so, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised within, I don't know how many years where that, even across medicine generally, where that, and I should say as a caveat, I was blown away by conference I went to, and I was invited to talk about our work with cancer distress and how, like, that's an area where which chemotherapy, oh, we threw this one out clinically, oh, but we can, person of certain genetics, life-saving, that you would have died 10 years ago. So there are areas of medicine, and always take anything with, I say, with a grain of salt. I'm a mere psychologist, but like oncologists have really made progress here. So I absolutely agree, and I'll also add that that's something really ripe for that sort of post-approval, large data set, phase 4 type data, big data, aggregate data, where you start to, you know, the more you collect and then you put together that big picture and you can figure out what could we do to predict who needs to get what. I think that's a huge potential.
That's maybe a little bit of a niche question, but are you aware of any studies investigating disorders of the consciousness, like the vegetative state?
Disorders of consciousness. So yeah, my buddy Robin published that great paper several years ago, theoretical paper. I think it's a great idea. So someone's in coma, you know, radically increase the dynamics of their brain network activity with one of these compounds and see if it works. I don't know if there's been any progress on that, but I absolutely think that's a really promising area. There was some discussion around it, all the ethics of that. And let me tell you, folks, if I'm in a coma, please don't break the law, but if there's an option like this that's available, I would want this done to my child. Again, I'm not, if it was legal, anybody, you know, like, yeah, do what you can to, like, you know, especially with a compound like DMT that's absurdly at the physiological level, very safe.
Noted.
Yeah, okay. You have my informed consent. You're saying a guy in Canada is actually doing that now, an audience member said. What's that? Okay, great. I'm glad people are exploring all these angles, because that was a great theoretical paper, and it truly is something that should be explored.
You talked about how in oncology, the oncologists have really got it serious, you know, the oncologists, right? Really doing that right, and they've made a lot of progress, right? So, but I guess my question is, the obvious first route for psychedelics or the neuroplastogens was the mind, but are we seeing any signal of going beyond neuropsychiatric diseases? Because I worked in the field of immunology, in strategy side, and one thing that was kind of neglected or kind of just dealt with in an inefficient way was depression in rheumatoid arthritis patients. So you had them taking an old cheap, really bad, nasty methotrexate with a really old, bad third, tricyclic antidepressant. So are there opportunities to, as you were saying, depression oncology patients, but actually this potentiating cyclical way of helping somebody with their depression and rheumatoid arthritis and giving them like an anti-TNF, but because of the anti-inflammatory effects of the neuroplastogens helps with the mood, and we've seen a 25-30% placebo effect in rheumatoid arthritis patients versus drugs. So there's very high placebo effects in rheumatoid arthritis with a manifestation of what they are thinking with their mind, and also emerging very small signal of the gut biomaxis. How do you think those three ecosystems can play together, benefiting from neuroplastogens or psychedelics?
Well, So I'd agree with all of this. This is really important. And we've already talked about the anti-inflammatory effects. Gosh, we haven't mentioned it in neurology, the really promising headache work for not only cluster, but much more people migraine, the great work going on at Yale right now for that. The entire idea of psychosomatic medicine. There were some weird anecdotes in our cancer distress research where, we had 51 participants. We had no statistical power to pick up any sort of indirect effect, but given what we know about the role of the mind and psychological orientation in terms of the disease process itself, my bet would be if we had 1,000 people with a particular type of cancer, because it hampered us to pick up on some sort of medical effect on the cancer, the variability across all, bone cancer versus pancreatic, et cetera. But if we had 1,000 people with like one particular form of cancer, I would not be at all surprised if there was this indirect effect of actually helping, like making tumors less likely to show up. I'm not saying we know that. I'm just saying I think that's a very real possibility, given the powerful effects in changing psychological orientation. And there's this whole constellation. So my great colleague Al Garcia, he presented the other day data on people with Alzheimer's disease, and he's looking at both probably the primary hypothesis, or the one you're going to put more money on if you were betting, is like in our cancer work and the other great cancer work Charlie Grove and Steve Ross have done, that you'd get the decreased depression, decreased demoralization, decreased anxiety, this type of thing. But he's also looking at the potential for decreased rate of cognitive decline, which theoretically, first principles, makes sense given the role we're figuring out about inducing neuroplasticity that we're seeing in the animal models that David Olson and Alex Kwan and so many great others, Brian Roth, have really shown. He's also doing work in Lyme disease, what used to be called chronic Lyme, but I think now the right term is post-Lyme disease syndrome, where doctors have really figured out, there really is something here for at least a subset of people to believe they have it. It's a real phenomenon. And so just imagine if you're one of those folks and the demoralization and being told by a dozen doctors it's all in your head, and it's not. And so, but that's another thing where, hey, maybe there's an effect on the demoralization, but maybe there's an effect on the disease process itself. I mean, that's an interesting one because it might probably involves inflammatory, but also that perhaps indirect effect through just changing psychosomatically your orientation on your quote, non-psychiatric medical outcomes themselves. So yeah, all of this, I mean, it's really exciting.
Everything is connected, so it's like eggs and chicken. What was first the inflammation and then disease, mood state and everything. So maybe in the future when more psychedelics for your state of mind, more people will use, we will see less cancer and other diseases, which basically may cause from the stress and from the inflammation.
Finding out all those things, how everything is connected and interconnected and plays a role is fascinating. But I think where you're going is actually crossing that gap to implementation and creating something that will do good to patients, because we could do research about everything. I have a lot of questions, but we should also think about what will that answer and how will that serve the patients, and radical ideas and how to found them.
So we think about patients, yeah. So we want the drug not because to bring the new drug, we think about patients.
Exactly, that was.
And we can be patients, but we are ourselves in the future, so we work for ourselves.
To add to that, these ideas aren't in a vacuum, right? These ideas are in a context, whether we like it or not, right? So there's some elements of the reality that that a good idea needs to go through to make it to the market. It's to some people using the term market in healthcare is almost an offensive term, but it's one of the realities that we have to deal with. So there's some elements where you can box, where we should fight, and there's some elements where it's more Tai Chi, redirecting energy, no matter, but not acknowledging that reality, the realities of the world we live in aren't going to help speed novel and radical ideas to the people that could benefit them.
Completely agree. I think that's a great final statement. Anyone else? So thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Matt.
Just an encouragement to invite the conversations, with us. With those, maybe the specific ideas that maybe you didn't want to share or whatever afterwards, but please, the main point is the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Hayim. Thank you, Kostya.
Thank you. Thanks.